Hello, welcome everyone to part two of our ISO 27001 series. We're doing 4 parts to this series. Hopefully you were able to listen to part one, which is basically everything you need to know to get started with ISO. Today we're going to be talking about everything you need to get ready for an ISO 27001 audit. If you missed the first video, if you're new to this series, you've never seen me or Risk 360 before, just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Sawyer Miller. I'm a senior manager here at Risk 360. I oversee the ISO practice. And Risk 360 is a consulting firm that works with companies to build security, privacy, and compliance programs that leave no doubt. So with that, I hope that you'll stick with us through the presentation here. It'll be a little shorter, probably 20-25 minutes or so, but it's broken into just a couple of basic parts. And so the first thing we'll talk about is before the audit, things you need to consider prior to going into that external audit to actually get certified. The second section of the presentation is around effort estimates. So basically during the audit, things that you need to consider. And then the third section will be after the audit, things you need to think about to make sure it wraps up well and that the organization is set up for success during those following surveillance audits. And then I've also got a slide on special considerations. These are things that I commonly see as hiccups between a year one initial certification audit and a year two surveillance audit. So you'll want to stay tuned for that, especially if you're just going into this for the first time or you're in that between year one and year two phase especially. So, all right. So the first slide is around before the audit, things you need to think about. So the first thing is confirming the scope and making sure that it meets the business requirements or the business needs. So as a part of ISO 27001, clause 4 calls for this exercise, basically, right? It says that you need to ensure that the ISMS, the Information Security Management System, is scoped appropriately. And what that means is that you are considering the appropriate internal and external stakeholders, the things that they care about, and you're building an appropriate fence, we'll call it, around particular data sets and things that, assets that those stakeholders care about. Well, with the with the certification, you want to do the same, right? You want to make sure that the certification scoping statement, which is something that your external auditor is going to confirm with you, resonates with those stakeholders. You're going through this process most likely because some stakeholders want you to, so you want to make sure that the language on that certificate speaks to what they want you to build an ISMS around. The next thing you want to do is review the statement of applicability. So maintaining and producing a statement of applicability is a requirement per ISO 27001, but you also want to make sure that you really give this thing some consideration. So it's actually ironic. I put a post out recently on LinkedIn. You can search my name on LinkedIn. I'm the only Sawyer at Risk 360. So and find the post, but it was funny because the post was about a new control that's coming out with 27002 updates, but the majority of the engagement in the comment section was around a statement of applicability and whether or not that is something worth putting time into or not. It's very interesting, the different perspectives that are out there. What I'll say is that the standard calls for a statement of applicability, so it's a must-have. And the purpose of this document, according to the standard, is that you justify not only exclusions of controls, but also inclusions of controls. And so the methodology that the standard calls for is that you assess the risk of your organization, you assess the risk of specifically the in-scope assets, threats, vulnerabilities, things like that, specifically around the ISMS that you've scoped in the first bullet point, and you develop a set of controls that appropriately addresses those risks. And within the statement of applicability, you explain for those that are included why that is. A lot of organizations start with the 27002 control set flat out. They don't make any changes. They don't customize the controls, and that's a perfectly fine approach. I advise that for most companies doing this for the first year. But you still want to consider each and every control and how and why it may be applicable or not. The next thing you want to do is prepare the team for the audit. If you're going into this thinking that one or two people can just carry the entire audit, chances are that's not going to be the case. Auditors want to talk to control owners. Right? They want to talk to the people who are in charge of making sure that the ISMS is operating. And there's a lot of different areas of responsibility, right? There's everything from engineering and development to HR controls. There's usually legal considerations from a compliance perspective. There's asset management, so core IT functions. The customer support team could be in scope if they're accessing sensitive client data. There's a lot of parties involved, right? And so what you want to do is make sure that those teams are aware of what's coming up and that you've prepped them appropriately. Now, this isn't like a script rehearsal for a legal interview in a courtroom. This is more of an understanding of what their area of responsibility is so that they can speak to that. If you've done this thing right, you've implemented these controls well, then there's not a lot of beating around the bush that needs to happen. But there can be a lot of confusion around the lingo sometimes if people are not familiar with sort of the audit speak or the standards language. And so you want to try to avoid those hiccups and roadblocks by prepping the team, helping them understand specifically, here's the wording of the standard and the controls that you're responsible for, and helping them understand what it is they're going to need to demonstrate as operating effectively. That kind of leads to the next point, which is don't just put it on them to do and say, okay, good luck, see you at the audit. Do spot checks, right? You want to make sure that you're looking at these controls alongside those control owners, and you're making sure that what they're doing is meeting the standard and it's meeting the stated controls in the statement of applicability. So make sure that you're helping in that way. The next one, this is something I always advise: build a great relationship with the auditor. I truly mean this. I've not met an auditor who does not operate with integrity. It's surprising, to be frank. I actually thought that there would be less integrity in the industry just because of the other things that I've been in the software world. It just seems like you'll do whatever you have to win, but auditors take their job very seriously, and I myself do the same, and I appreciate that about the industry. But building a good relationship, it doesn't influence the audit in any way, but it helps make a better communication line. It can save you time, simply put. And so for that reason alone, build a good relationship with your auditor. Make sure that they are aware of your organization, that they understand the context. Help them do a good job because you give them a lot of good information and content and context about your organization, and they'll help make sure that you guys understand what they're doing, and if there are any gaps, what those are. But again, don't take this bullet point as something that's going to grease the skid, so to speak, on the audit by any means, because it's not. But it is going to help build a better communication line, and it's going to help eliminate any confusion around any type of bullet points that people may be confused on. All right, next is have a clear project plan. So ideally, you've already done these spot checks on the controls. You're aware of where your organization stands against the standard. Make sure that leading up to the audit that you have continually looked at the performance of remediation against the gaps that you identify. What I would typically advise, especially if this is your first year, is conduct your internal audit 5-6 months ahead of the external audit. You want to make sure that you have plenty of time between that internal audit and the external audit so that you have time to remediate the gaps that are found. In between there, you're going to want to verify and validate, as required in clause 10.1, that any nonconformities that were identified as a part of the internal audit have been remediated. So you want to make sure that you have clear project plans. You don't want any confusion about what needs to happen tactically to execute on the remediation plans. And you want to make sure everyone's on the same page with good, clear communication. Lastly, set a status report cadence. create a bi-weekly meeting. Honestly, if it's your first year, I'd say monthly might be too infrequent. I would say consider at the longest a bi-weekly cadence with the team, with control owners, with the appropriate folks, to make sure that everyone is staying on the same page. You can tailor that back a little bit once you get through that first year and people sort of understand what this exercise is all about. But that's not something that you can do later on, right? You don't want to get to the audit and wish you had done that. You want to make sure to if anything, overdo it leading up to that audit to make sure that you're prepped, and then you can adjust accordingly based on the results. All right. Next slide. So during the audit, this is during the external audit. I would call this information you need to know to fulfill one of those previous bullet points, which is prepping the team. So people need to understand time commitments, what they're getting into, what's expected of them based on their department, etc. The first thing you want to do is provide context and ensure that the parties know what to expect. So I touched on this a little bit, but again, ideally within your statement of applicability, you've assigned control ownership. So you can filter, if it's in Excel or something, you can filter and determine exactly who owns which controls. So you can give someone a pared down list and say, hey, here's the 15 controls that you're responsible for. These are the things you need to understand about these controls. Here's the language. Give them the standard. I cannot stress this enough. Give them ISO 27002 if that's the control set that you're using, so that they have the implementation guidance. It's the rule book, right? It's the guidance. It's the thing that auditors are going to use to help run and inform their audit activities. Why not use it to help prep yourself? So show them the controls, show them how to navigate that document, help them understand everything in that document is not a requirement by any means. Most of it, in fact, is simply a recommendation of things to consider. But again, it helps dispel a lot of that like confusion of, what exactly do I need to do to fulfill control XYZ. The next thing you want to do is provide all evidence on time to the auditor. So your auditor is going to be asking for stage one, it'll be probably 35 to 40 evidence artifacts, could be less, could be more. That's usually going to be pretty easy to achieve. For stage two, though, or for surveillance audits, you're going to be asked to provide probably 100-ish evidence artifacts. Now, these things ideally were inspected during an internal audit as well. So hopefully it's not too much of a burden to determine how to actually collect this information. But you want to make sure that this stuff gets to the auditor on time. I promise you, you do not want a rushed auditor. You want them to have the time to look at the evidence, to ask follow-up questions if something's not clear, and you want to make sure that you're not putting yourself and the auditor up against a tighter timeline for just simply the fact that the evidence wasn't there. A lot of firms have pretty strict policies in their contracts. Most of them don't enforce them if they can avoid it, but they have some pretty strict terms around when you have to provide evidence and financial penalties for not doing so by the deadline. So make sure you're aware of those. The next is be engaged during walkthroughs. So again, if you're that one or two person or people who represent the sort of core compliance and security team, you're most likely going to be on a majority of the walkthroughs, a majority of the audit already. But make sure that other folks, those control owners, are clear on when they need to be there and that they're engaged during that. Again, 9 times out of 10, the more context that you give an auditor around how you do something, the better off you're going to be. ISO is one of those unique standards that it doesn't call for a ton of super prescriptive stuff. It leaves a lot up to you to determine what's appropriate for the organization. And you want to make sure that you're engaged with that auditor and explaining to them how you've achieved the spirit of the requirements of the controls. Because that's really what it's all about at the end of the day. So make sure you're engaged, make sure you're trying to give them what they're looking for. A lot of times, I'll just say this, a lot of times an auditor understands the control. They don't understand your organization like you do. I mean, think about it. They've been introduced to you for maybe 20 hours tops. You know, all the planning and studying and things that they've done of your organization up to the audit. I mean, think back when you started your job, how much did you know by day 2.5, right? So that's where they're sitting. So be mindful of that, and be engaged and help them understand the context that they need so they can do their job, because it's going to help you and it's going to help things go smoother, I promise. Next thing is know your controls. Again, this should go without saying, but you own your control set. If you work with Risk 360 on ISO implementations and advisement, if you work with any other firm, if you have a contractor who comes in and helps with your program, whatever the case is, you as the organization, including top management, they don't need to know everything, but you need to know your control set. You need to understand what it means to you know, have effective change management from Annex 12. Or you need to understand what a user access review should look like and who should be doing it and what your organization has interpreted as appropriate for an access review. The better that you know your own controls, the better you're going to be able to defend them, and the more confidence you're going to instill in an auditor. So be aware of that. If you're leaning on some third party or outside party who is not a full-time employee of the organization to guide you through this, I would definitely caution you there. Lastly, form a partnership with the auditor. So I've talked about this a lot already. You want to make sure that you're not only you know, building a relationship with them as a person, but that you're understanding the value that their firm can bring to your firm, right? A lot of times we're guilty of thinking that, you know, these auditors, they're just there to sort of check the box and come in and provide a service and give us a certificate and head out. But in fact, they're you know, they're wealths of knowledge. They can share a lot of information with you guys about a lot of really helpful things. And so it's better to have that open communication line as a true business partner, so that when new business needs come up, you have a resource there. Risk 360 included. We try to make sure that we're partners with our customers and not just you know, transactional business partners. So I shared this table on the right in my last presentation during part 1. I'll go through it again briefly. These are the time commitments, estimates that you can expect during the audit. So leadership, this is top leadership, typically a C-level executive. They're going to spend between 2 and 4 hours. They need to be able to discuss really any given parts of clauses 4 through 10. They need to understand how that is pieced together and architected. And they need to understand what authority has been delegated out by them. Security and GRC, this is going to be the core team typically. They're going to spend the most time gathering evidence, talking to auditors, etc. IT, because it's an information security management system, IT is almost always heavily involved. A lot of screenshots, a lot of evidence there. Engineering is also going to be involved. So if you write code, if you develop software products, you know, even if it's hardware, whatever it is, if you have an engineering team, typically they're working on sensitive assets that are in scope for the ISMS. They're going to spend about 4 to 8 hours. HR, legal, facilities altogether 5 to 10 hours. They just have different respective areas of responsibility that they're going to need to speak to during the audit and provide evidence for. All right. So after the audit, how to wrap up and make sure that things go smoothly. And I'm sorry, everyone, you're going to have to give me just a second. I've been a little sick recently, so I'm going to go on mute for just a moment. All right, sorry about that. We're working with it. We're working through it here. All right, so after the audit, things you want to consider. You want to, again, form that relationship and that business partnership with the auditor, and then work with them to ensure on-time report delivery. I'll put it this way. When an auditor understands your business needs, when they understand, I need this report by December 31st, right? I've got stakeholders, I've got deals on the line that my revenue department is really, really depending on here. when they understand the context, because you've communicated with them, because you've formed a good, healthy relationship with them as a partner, they're going to be more motivated and likely to help make sure that things internally go to plan, right? And I'm not saying that there's ever like there's no laziness. These external audit firms are very busy. They have a lot of clients because it's an exploding framework, frankly. But my point is, you want an advocate internally there, and that auditor can be your advocate to help deliver the materials that you need to demonstrate your program to the market. So form that relationship, work with them to help make sure that you're tracking where the report is in the cycle and that you're going to get that on time as expected. Complete nonconformities and corrective actions. Thoroughly review clause 10.1. I'll say that again, thoroughly review clause 10.1. You want to make sure that each and every bullet point of clause 10.1 is addressed for nonconformities and for the information relevant there. Most of the audit firms are going to give you a form to fill out for nonconformities that follows clause 10.1. It's very intentional, but you still want to be familiar with the requirements there and make sure that you're following that through the year. Next, ensure all parties understand what they need to do to maintain the program. So ideally, if you've worked with those control owners throughout the year, if you've helped them understand what controls they're responsible for, then you're also going to have a good relationship with them and be able to help them understand what maintenance activities look like. So particular controls need to be done on a recurring basis, right? Access reviews, there's policy reviews. There's a lot of stuff that needs to happen over the year. You've basically started a machine that's going to need maintenance, right? You need to oil the gears and make sure that all the fluids are changed, right? You want to make sure that this machine continues to operate well throughout the year, so that during your surveillance audit you don't have any issues. So work with those parties, help them understand that this was not a one-time deal. This is something that we need to continue doing. And I'll talk about it on the next slide, but help them identify areas for improvement, not just from a security perspective, but from a business process perspective. Help them understand, how can I achieve the controls in a more efficient, better for my organization way, right? Next is schedule the audit for next year. That seems straightforward, but make sure that you have the time blocked off with the right people very early on. Too often I see clients get pushed up against a much tighter deadline than they anticipated because they didn't schedule things early enough. Now they're competing for time slots with the external auditor. They've got control owners that are saying, hey, I'm on vacation that week, right? So make sure that you're communicating that stuff early and often, so you have plenty of time to handle any of that stuff. Scheduling should not be an issue, given that you are scheduling this stuff a year out typically. All right, and then last point here, think about how you're going to share the accomplishment. So you're going to receive a ISO 27001 certificate. It's going to state what the scope was, who performed your audit. It's going to have some very official logos on it, ANAB and UCAS typically if it's an accredited certification body, which is definitely what you want. So you're going to want to share that certificate with people, right? Those stakeholders, external stakeholders specifically, you're going to want to show that off. They're usually the ones who wanted you to go through this exercise to begin with. A lot of them are going to ask for more detailed information. They're going to say, hey, I see a statement of applicability referenced here against your certificate. I'd like to see that. I'd like to see what controls are in scope and how you justified them. That's honestly a reason I would advocate for taking that exercise seriously. Some of them may ask to see the report. You need to decide, am I going to provide that to clients? Am I going to give that to prospects or not? Beyond that, who's going to do it? And a lot of people miss this, but this is actually mandated for you to think through this prior to certification as a part of clause 7.4. It's not always caught because it's sort of a chicken and an egg thing, but you should technically determine, according to the requirements of clause 7.4, who's going to share what and how they're going to do it before that audit. And that includes materials related to your actual certification and program. Okay, so last slide here is special considerations. Again, these are 4 bullet points that I commonly see companies. I see them misplanning for these. I'll put it that way. You know, a lot of times you get through this very big exercise, you're really excited to be done with it, and you let your breath out and just sort of relax. Don't do that too long. I'll put it that way. So the first thing is make sure that your management reviews, clause 9.3, and your risk assessments, clause 6.1, are conducted on time. Usually you want no more than 12 months between those activities. If you scheduled these things right before the initial audit because you were trying to get everything in, consider spreading that out, right? The management review is meant to help provide a lot of good feedback for the ISMS and for the control owners operating in the ISMS. So make sure you take that management review exercise and you get the business value out of it that you're supposed to get, right? Same for the risk assessment. A lot of times you're going to learn a lot more after having gone through this, you know, sleeping on this night after night, beginning to sort of digest and really understand the standard better. Control owners are going to start thinking differently. That risk assessment should continue to provide you value year over year. But the one thing I commonly see is it gets rushed because people procrastinate and postpone it, and then it doesn't add a lot of value, and it becomes a little bit of an annoyance to people because they're sort of checking the box. Next is continual improvement takes deep thought and time. So this is another one. If you wait until a month before your audit to start thinking about continual improvement, you're going to struggle to demonstrate that you've actually continually improved to your auditor. This is something you need to think about consistently. And the beauty of this, right, is that you can achieve continual improvement by simply maintaining the requirements of clauses 4 through 10. You can actually look at the management review. You can look at the self-evaluation activities. You can look at the risk assessment. And you can take the results of these activities and easily identify improvement points. So use that to your advantage, right? And think deeply about how can I not only continue to maintain compliance, but how can I make it less of an administrative burden and more business value to my organization? The third point is internal audit results need to be delivered with plenty of time to remediate. So I touched on this earlier. During year 1, you definitely want plenty of time because you may not know what you're getting into. But during years 2 and 3, you may be surprised at the things that auditors continue to find. So your internal audit, whether it be a resource within the organization, an external firm like Risk 360 performing the audit, whatever it may be, make sure that you're planning that with plenty of time to remediate the items found during that prior to your next audit. This is going to help you tremendously. And then the last point, I touched on this earlier in the presentation, but I can't say it enough. Follow up with control owners early and often. Don't leave them hanging. Make sure you're staying top of mind for them. And this is, I would increase the font of this bullet point more the bigger the organization is, right? I've seen it so many times where you have a core, 5 or 10 people on a security and GRC team. They're feeling really good about the program. Maybe they haven't talked to a particular department for a couple months. They go check in with them, and turns out that person who learned all this great stuff about ISO and really helped them during the audit last year because they understood how to speak the lingo and pull the evidence has left. And they didn't know it because they're a 30,000 person company. So make sure that you're identifying your stakeholders, you're maintaining those relationships, and you're working with those control owners, again, early and often. All I can say is just don't rush the 4 activities listed above to check the box, because you're going to miss a lot of the intended business value that ISO 27001 means for you to attain. So, also, I'll mention, I called this out on the Part 1 series as well. If you're interested in looking at how your organization stands against ISO 27001, you can go sign up for our completely free GRC platform. We have more premium features in there that you can pay for, but you should have enough free tools here to help you understand exactly where your organization stands against the ISO 27001 standard, totally free of cost. We've put a ton of time and effort into developing the questions, the report card, and the recommendations. Please take advantage of it. I would encourage you to do this before you engage anyone externally. This is going to only help you. Be honest, take your time, and just know that this isn't something that is going to be shared with anyone. This is just something that is literally just a self-assessment tool. So please take advantage of that. I hope that it helps you. Our goal in offering this for free is to genuinely move the needle on changing the space and helping combat cybercrime. That's something we find that we really hold core to our values here at IRIS 360. So if you have any questions on this, let us know. The website is phalanxgrc.com. It's right there at the top of the slide. phalanxgrc.com. phalanxgrc.com. So, all right. With that, I will stop. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. Send them over however you're able to through the webinar technology, and I'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah, so we actually have a few questions so far. So the first question we got, and actually I've already replied to this to everyone in the thread, but I wanted to bring it out again. Is the first section recorded? Can it be shared, and can the deck be shared as well? Guys, I actually sent out a link to everyone to our YouTube channel with the video. So if you want to watch the first one, go back and watch the first one. We're actually putting together an ebook once we finished all of the webinars Sawyer's doing currently, and that will be shared with everyone who's registered for these webinars. So we come in your email box. So that's the first question. The next question, it's actually pretty long. So during the audit, how much of the attention is paid to clauses 4 through 10? Is this as important as Annex A controls? And who from the organization is involved most during the time of the clauses 4 through 6 audit?
Yeah, good question. So clause 4 through 10 is technically what you're getting certified against. The Annex A controls are only there because clause 6 calls for a set of controls to manage your risks appropriately. So it's a little bit of an oxymoron because the auditor will spend, just based on volume of time, more time looking at the Annex A controls simply because there's more line items, right? Currently, there's 114 controls. It just takes time to evaluate each and every one of those. But that is not, they're not even going to look at Annex A if you don't have clauses 4 through 10 nailed down. So you need to make sure that you understand clauses 4 through 10 because it's basically the instruction booklet for how to form an ISMS. There's actually a standard out there, ISO 27003, that is implementation guidance on clauses 4 through 10. So if you're struggling with clauses 4 through 10, you can go download ISO 27003. Like all the ISO standards, you have to pay a little bit for it, but it can really help you understand what they're looking for there. Now, in terms of who's going to spend time, that's where top management, so the topmost authority within the department, business unit, the organization, whatever it is that encompasses the scope of the ISMS, whoever that person is, top management needs to be aware of clauses 4 through 10 and needs to understand at least who's responsible for each aspect of it. They don't need to know every single detail of every single activity, especially the bigger the organization, the harder that this becomes. But they need to understand the structure, right? They need to understand the reporting lines, need to understand, to an extent, the cadence and frequencies of activities. The core team, whoever that is, whatever you describe them as, whether you're a small organization and it's just a guy or a gal who's wearing an and one responsibility hat in addition to their other job, or it's a very big mature organization and you have a team of 15 people, whoever that core team is that's been tasked with, hey, help run, help implement, help understand the ISO 27001 program, you can expect to spend a majority of the time on the clause 4 through 10 interviews, because you're going to be the one who understands the ins and outs of all the activities going on to facilitate and support the implementation of clauses 4 through 10.
Okay. We actually have another question. It seems like it's coming from an auditor too. Do you have any tips to help your customers understand the importance of the ISO 27000 certification and how it helps them in a competitive way?
Yeah, I mean, I'll put it this way. If they can't justify it with revenue, then they need to justify it with either risk reduction or cost containment. It's pretty cut and dry, really, when you think about it that way. So basically, what that translates to is if a customer is not asking for this, you need to determine, will this contain our costs in some way as an organization, or will this reduce our risk, and is that risk reduction worth the investment? You have to do the ROI calculation on this, right? I'm not here to say every organization in the world should have ISO 27001. I'm here to say, for those who have deemed themselves appropriate for getting this, here's how to think through it. So I would go through that exercise of building that ROI case with the customer.
Okay. And the next question is, what are the most important things to consider when choosing an auditor?
So there are required qualifications that auditor must have. If you're talking about the individual, there's independence, there's knowledge that they need to have, integrity, there's sort of a code of ethics they need to follow. But if you're talking about a firm, for your external auditor, what you want is someone who is accredited. Typically, it's going to be by either ANAB or UCAS. They're the two main accreditation bodies that audit the certification bodies to make sure that they're following 17,021, which is a standard that governs how a certification body is intended to operate to issue certifications. So your certification body gets audited by accreditation bodies. So make sure that they're accredited and they're in good standing there. There's a few links out there where you can find these lists. The other thing to consider is, if you're talking about an internal auditor, you want someone who's gone through the gambit, right? You want someone who understands the program within the context of your organization. So, we at 360, we target the high growth tech niche, the high growth tech industry. We have a broad array of clients, because high growth tech does not necessarily mean a particular size. You could be 50 people, you could be 30,000. And it does not necessarily mean software, but it does mean high growth tech. And we say that because if you're, say, a food manufacturer, we're probably not the internal auditor for you, right? You're going to want to find an internal auditor who understands ISO 27001 within the confines of your industry. Make sure that you're vetting those internal auditors in that way, and it's not just someone who's an expert on the standard, because the more context they have on what you do and what is important to your business, the better those results of the internal audit are going to be, and the smoother your external audit is going to go.
Okay. The next question is, what does a good auditor relationship look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think in between audits, it's it's check-ins, it's making sure that you're aware of activities coming up. I mean, look, I'm not saying you need to have like a weekly touch base with these people. That's probably unrealistic. You have a day job, they have a day job, but it does mean spending a little extra time here and there, helping to make sure that, one, you're understanding their business, how things might be moving there. This isn't just a one-way street, right? You might want to understand how your certification body is changing or shaping. You might say, hey, we see you guys got a private equity investment. How does that change the organization? Or we see you guys are growing quickly, or we see you're in the news for this. How did that go? Like, those bullet points might inform decisions that you make. So that's part of it. The other part is share about your organization. You want them to understand, hey, we're growing. We're looking at, these other markets throughout the world. They're going to have good information for you on things to consider. So I'd say just, make sure that you're sharing business level information in a free manner within a reasonable cadence.
Okay, and we have one last question. And this is, how do I get Risk 360 to help with my ISO program?
Yeah, so you can do a ton of research on what we do and probably answer most of your questions yourself if you're not interested in talking to a person just yet. But if you are to that point and you'd like to explore an engagement with us, just go to risk360.com. And there's a button in the top right there that you can click. Fill out the form. Our revenue team will receive that. They'll see that. We'll set up calls with the appropriate SMEs. So like if you come to us and say, hey, I'd like to talk to you about an ISO implementation, you'll go through an initial call with the revenue team to understand the context there. They'll take some good notes, help back brief us, and then you'll probably wind up on a call with me. And so it's a pretty straightforward process here, but I'd say go to the website, start there, fill out that form, and yeah, we'll get moving with you.
Cool. Well, thank you, sir. That's our last question. I also want to encourage everyone, if you haven't yet, to go to risk360.com, check out our resource center. We have a lot of great videos of Sawyer going through ISO 27001, as well as like our YouTube channel. We're constantly posting new videos. This video here will actually post it in the next couple of days on there as well. If you subscribe, you'll get all that information. So thank you guys very much for taking your time today, and thank you, Sawyer, for all the great content.
Yeah, thanks for your time. See ya.